This section of the lymphatic system and immune system chapter is going to concentrate on the organs and tissues of the lymphatic system. The organs of the lymphatic system are separated into two groups: the primary lymphoid tissues and organs and the secondary lymphoid tissues and organs. The primary ones are red bone marrow, which is found within the spaces in bones, and the thymus. Now, the reason these two are listed as primary is because they're associated with an important developmental aspect for a certain type of white blood cell. When we're thinking about what those primary lymphoid tissues are for, we can associate B with the red bone marrow and T with the thymus because they're related to B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes, respectively. Red bone marrow isn't an organ unto itself, it's a tissue within another organ, which is in the bone. Now, red bone marrow, as we've already looked at within the blood chapter, is important for making blood cells. It's red because of all of the red blood cells that are being made. But what we're interested in here is the production of white blood cells. The pluripotent stem cell for blood cells is found in the red bone marrow, and it gives rise to all of the different types of blood cells. It's just that white blood cells are such a small population compared to red blood cells that the color really is about the red bone marrow. Now, this picture indicates yellow bone marrow, which is not related to bone marrow making blood cells. It's really just adipose tissue that's developed out of the original reticular tissue that was the red bone marrow as it's become less and less active making blood cells. The thymus is located just anterior to the heart, really covering up the base of the heart and where the major blood vessels connect to it. We don't usually see the thymus in anatomical models because it obscures our view of the heart. Also, it's only active during childhood and adolescence. So in an adult torso model, the thymus really is not a functional organ, so it wouldn't be included in that model. Now, the thymus is an important part of the development of certain cells in the immune system, namely T lymphocytes, and the T in T lymphocyte stands for thymus. Within the structure of the thymus, we'll see that there's a similarity to lymph nodes, which I'll talk about in a little bit. The thymus contains reticular connective tissue, just like red bone marrow and the other lymphatic organs and tissues, arranged into lobules within the organ with medullary centers within the tissue where the cells are being made. All of the other organs of the lymphatic system are secondary lymphoid tissues, which is because they are not directly involved in the development of those lymphocytes, the B cells and the T cells. We want to begin by looking at the lymph node. It's sort of the representative lymphatic organ, and we'll compare the other ones to that, including the thymus, which we already looked at. Lymph nodes are composed of reticular connective tissue surrounded by a capsule. The lymph fluid gets into the lymph nodes coming through afferent lymphatic vessels. The word afferent means leading to, and the fluid leaves through the efferent lymphatic vessels, meaning going away from. There are more afferent vessels than efferent vessels, so that a slow trickle of fluid into the lymph node will build up some pressure trying to get out through just a couple or so vessels leading out. The vessels all have valves at their base so that once fluid gets into the lymph node, it's not going to get back out through the afferent vessels. And once it passes through the efferent vessels, it's not going to get back into the lymph node, to ensure that the direction of flow is maintained in just one way. Now, the fluid flows in through the afferent vessels and gets into a sinus space just below the capsule called the subcapsular sinus. Extensions from the capsule are called trabeculae, and they're surrounded by a sinus also called the trabecular sinus, which isn't highlighted in this figure. That brings the fluid towards the middle or medulla region of the lymph node, and then it gets out through the efferent vessels. The reticular tissue is organized into lobules, and each lobule has at its center a germinal center with tissue that appears different from the surrounding cell-dense tissue, and then there's a cell-sparse area, which is where we lead into the sinus area around the trabeculae or the subcapsular sinus. The tonsils are situated around the opening of the oral and nasal cavity into the pharynx, and they're positioned in a perfect location to be prepared for airborne or foodborne pathogens that might get into our system. Now, tonsils are kind of like big lymph nodes, except that they don't have afferent vessels coming into them. Instead, they have structures called crypts, which are really crevices in the wall of the tonsil that fluid, whether it's mucus from the respiratory system or saliva from the digestive system, that fluid gets in. If there are airborne or foodborne pathogens in that fluid, they get into the crypt, which to a pathogen seems like a perfect location to start to reproduce. Nice neighborhood, you can raise your family, good schools, etc., etc. The problem is that they don't realize that just over the fence, the capsule of the tonsil, are white blood cells ready to fight off that infection. And those white blood cells can also move from the tonsil through the lymphatic system to other structures, alerting the rest of the immune system for the potential infection coming from whatever might have been trapped in the crypt, because there's going to be many more pathogens making their way down through the respiratory or digestive system, depending on which way they're getting in. The spleen is like just one big lymph node, which has a different function rather than transporting lymph around. It's a filter for the blood. Instead of afferent vessels, the splenic artery brings blood in, and the blood infuses through the tissue through sinusoidal capillaries. Essentially, the blood just becomes a factor in the tissue there instead of interstitial fluid. Red blood cells that are out of date are cleared away. Pathogens that might be in the blood can be removed, those sorts of things. And then the blood comes back together into the splenic vein to be cleared out. It's kind of like just a big lymph node with blood passing through it rather than lymph, so that it can filter out debris, damaged cells, pathogens, those sorts of things from the blood. There's a type of lymphoid tissue associated with the mucous linings of the various systems, the respiratory, digestive, urinary, and reproductive tracts. It's called mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, or MALT. These are nodules of lymphoid tissue that are embedded into the mucosa layer of those organs, and they act kind of like integrated lymph nodes within there. Each nodule looks like a lobule of one lymph node. It has a germinal center kind of structure surrounded by a cell dense area that fades out to a cell sparse area. It's just integrated into this other organ rather than being an organ unto itself. Now, in the digestive system, and specifically in the small intestine, the traditional name for the MALT in that organ is a Peyer's patch, which is what you see labeled here. But really, we see them in a lot of different locations. The book also makes reference to the bronchus-associated lymphatic tissue, which is specifically in the mucosa of the bronchi. And it's pointed out specifically because it's another location where airborne pathogens are dealt with by the lymphatic system and the immune response. You may have been taught in elementary school that the appendix is a vestigial organ for humans. That's not really true. It's just adapted to a different use from how we see it used in other organisms. In a dog, for instance, the cecum, part of the large intestine, is where vegetable matter is fermented and broken down to get additional nutrients out of it in a way that primates don't need. Primates have a longer large intestine, and that function takes place through the large intestine itself. The cecum is a little pouch off to the side of the large intestine in an animal like the dog, and in humans, while we have a region called the cecum, the pouch that comes off the end is what we call the vermiform appendix. And while it doesn't do the same thing in humans, it doesn't ferment vegetable matter, it is an important structure for the immune response. It has MALT associated with it also, but being a structure to itself, where it's located, right by the ileocecal juncture, it's in a perfect place to be able to keep the intestinal flora, the bacteria that live in our large intestine, under control. If they start growing out of control, then the appendix is located right next to where they might want to try to get into the small intestine to help alert the immune system and fight that off. Now, when that infection gets out of control, the appendix will often become engorged with that infection and might have to be removed before it burst. Before medical technology made it possible to do an appendectomy, the appendix was sort of the last line of defense. If it didn't do its job, it burst, and the person was going to die from that infection. Nowadays, it's the last line of defense before medical therapy can get in there. Now, in grade school, you hear about appendices being vestigial, but really they're another organ of the lymphatic system. Perhaps that myth is perpetuated because people are aware of appendectomies, that you can take an appendix out and the person's fine. If that were true, however, shouldn't in elementary school the tonsils be considered a vestigial organ too? You can take those out and the person can survive just fine. In both cases, the functions that those structures serve will be taken over by other lymphatic structures, but we also have medical technology to help improve immunity over what might have been possible thousands and thousands of years ago. Consider this question. When you feel that you've reached an answer, hit the next button to go into the next slide, which will reveal the correct answer. The tonsils, being arranged where the nasal cavity and the oral cavity open up into the pharynx, are situated perfectly to react to foodborne and airborne pathogens. And cells from the tonsils can move through the lymphatic system down to lymphatic structures around the respiratory or digestive tracts to alert the rest of the immune system to the presence of those pathogens.